Hi everyone, welcome back to Survivor Tribe. Today I am so excited because I'm releasing the first interview in a new series that I've created called Survivor Series. Survivor Series is a collection of interviews with real-life abuse survivors where we talk about what it's really like to be a survivor, and they chat on their own personal journeys from abuse to healing. These survivors are also doing really great things in the community by turning their pain into purpose. Please keep in mind that if you are an abuse survivor and you're susceptible to triggers, there is highly sensitive content in these interviews. In the first episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Michael Broussard. When Michael was a child, he was repeatedly raped by his stepfather. And these events took place where Michael should have felt safe, at school, at home, as well as at church. In this interview, Michael talks about the society standards that are placed on men when it comes to vulnerability, being groomed with pornography, how he once had fantasies about kicking the shit out of his abuser, the first night he worked as a male prostitute, whether or not he feels that survivors can be in healthy, loving relationships, the night he almost died, and how Doctor Who pulled him out of agoraphobia. Michael will also share his top 5 ingredients for healing and what he thinks every person who loves a survivor should know. If you would like to connect with Michael and show support for his Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor show after the interview, you can find links to his website and his social media channels in the description below. And if you're new to my channel and you would like to find out how to find your voice and heal after abuse, subscribe to my channel and click that notifications bell so you don't miss any new videos when I post them. Now on to the interview. Hi everyone, welcome to Survivor Series by Survivor Tribe. Today I have here with me Mr. Michael Broussard. Michael is a sex abuse survivor. He is also a writer and performer of the Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor show. And quite frankly, I think that he's a huge inspiration. Welcome to Survivor Tribe, Michael.
It's really good to be here, and I appreciate, that sounded like Vegas. It's really good to be here, but it is really good to be here, and I appreciate what you just said, and you know, we're all doing our part. We're all doing our bit. You're doing it, I'm doing it, and we're going to make a difference.
I totally agree. I'm so happy to have you here. You know, I think first and foremost, one of the things that I really want to say to you is that I just commend you on your bravery. You know, the past couple of weeks, I've been going through all of your content. I've watched your show, and I just greatly admire your rawness and your transparency in telling your story. And I also really want to commend you on being such a trailblazer for men, because I think that we could all agree that the standards that are put on men in society, you know, it can make it more difficult for men to come forward. Now, it's obviously always difficult for people to come forward, but men especially, just because of the how they tie masculinity into it. So I just really think that you're doing some really, really impressive work.
I really, really appreciate that. On the thing about men that's interesting for me is that, you know, vulnerability is very much something that many men are not allowed to, and they're not allowed by something they've kind of put on themselves, you know, toxic masculinity. We've had that culture. We put this thing on where you're not allowed to be vulnerable. You're not allowed to not be sure about where you are, how you feel. And one of the major things that came up for me with that recently, I have had an eating disorder all my life, okay? I have suffered from body dysmorphic disorder all my life. I still look in the mirror and go, look at that guy with the big handlebar ears and the greasy face. My God, anybody wants to talk to him? I'm surprised because he just looks weird and he's overweight and all these other things. And it was very recently that I finally kind of went public with that on Facebook and started talking about it because there's this thing with men, you don't usually talk about eating disorders and you don't usually talk about body dysmorphic disorder and how they're connected and how that affects you and how I can trace where it started for me. It started because the times I was away from my abuser was when I was visiting my grandmother. And my grandmother showed love with candy and cookies and ice cream and Nestle's Quick and all those things, you know?
As most grandparents do, right?
And that was, that to me became linked in my brain with what being safe and secure and happy for a brief period of time was. So my anxiety reaction is to eat, because I'm looking for that security I used to feel. And I think of my grandmother when I do it. This is all stuff I've been working out recently. And it's like, wow. So we do have eating disorders. I look at my body and, you know, I'm a skinny guy, and I know that intellectually, but I don't know it emotionally. People tell me that I'm not an ugly person, and I think people are beautiful in all different ways. That's the thing. Ugly people are ugly inside, but that's not really what I mean. But what I mean is, I think I look like a freak, and people don't think I look like a freak, and I haven't been able to intellectualize that. And from day to day, it gets worse or better what I see in the mirror and how terrified I am to go outside. So all of these things that we associate with women who are struggling, men struggle too. Not all of them, but we do. And I remember telling somebody privately that I had an eating disorder and that I had body dysmorphic disorder, and they just kind of slagged it off because I was a guy.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like they do that in general when it comes to any type of emotion that a man might express.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that we need to, and I say we as a culture need to be, particularly when it comes to men and what they do to themselves, we need to be more open to the idea that every human being has feelings and vulnerabilities, and stop telling people to man up and stop telling people that they're whining or whatever. Every human being deserves the opportunity to be respected for their feelings and their needs and the difficulties they go through.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to stop invalidating everyone's feelings. And I think we do way too much of that in society, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And on so many levels. I mean, I've talked with people about when people report, and based on what people know about their personal behavior, they get invalidated. Because it's your fault. I'll give you a real good example. And this is kind of a dangerous thing to say because I don't talk about this publicly a lot. But my in-laws are some of the least woke people you'll ever meet in your entire life. But they can fake being woke. They know what I do. They know I'm a survivor of sexual violence. And they've expressed nothing but empathy and respect for what I do. However, we're waiting to get our table in a restaurant, and it's me and my wife and my in-laws. And my mother-in-law starts going off about how, there was that thing where there were like the new jeans that were mostly ripped and there was very little material to them. Do you remember that big thing, that trend? It was
My grandfather likes to make fun of us when we wear jeans like that to his house. He's like, "What? You can't afford real jeans? You can't afford the full material?" Like, no, that's the style.
Exactly. Her reading is, it's no wonder these women get raped if they wear stuff like that. It's clearly there. She went on and on about this thing. And I said to her, I was like, you realize that you're saying this to somebody who's a rape survivor. And I said, I don't think what you're saying links up. And she got very serious and kind of looked and went, well, we think it does. And so I'm in front of her. So to me, in front of her, she supposedly cares about the fact that I'm a rape survivor. And she supposedly cares about the stuff that I struggle to get people to understand.
Yeah.
Only me, no one else. It's that selective empathy. Well, you're in my family, so I'm empathetic. But I will go on and on about how every survivor deserves what they got, except you, which is like, there's no honesty to that.
Do you think that is the case, or do you think it is more just not having a true understanding of what is or is not acceptable to say to a survivor? Because I've definitely caught myself in situations where I know that the friend or family member, they have really great intentions behind it, but the way that they word it is still, it just goes right through the heart, but they really don't realize it. And I think a big part of that is, like we were talking about earlier, just in educating people on what the do's and don'ts are.
You've got to challenge. I think it's very important to challenge because people maintain their prejudices and their misconceptions when they're not challenged. But we can't stop. I mean, we always talk about like the response to childhood sexual abuse. And I think the response to childhood sexual abuse is so dependent on, like you said, critical thinking. It's so dependent on people being open to learn about what it is and learn what it's like being a survivor. I mean, that's going to help us so much in the future if we can get people to hear it. And I don't want to be in a position where I'm just tired of trying to get people to hear it. I was in that position younger. I was frustrated. I turned it on myself. I was like, nobody understands. I don't know about you, but I was abused in the 1970s. Okay. There were no resources at all.
Yeah,
there
same.
was nothing. See?
Yeah.
And so at the time, I'm there going, I am the only person this has ever happened to. My family's telling me to shut up. I can't talk to anyone about it.
Yep.
and I'm alone in the universe. And to get to this position now where we have the internet, which people down a lot, but it's actually got some advantages.
Yeah.
When somebody has been abused, they can turn to all these groups online and they can talk to other people and these support pages to know you're not alone. I mean, the value of knowing you're not alone, that is a great thing that the internet does for us.
100%. I would say one of the most cathartic things that has happened during my healing process is I felt the same way. I was abused in the 80s and 90s. And I mean, I guess around mid 90s is when everyone started to have access to the internet, but that wasn't necessarily things that I was looking up. So I always felt the same way. You know, maybe this is the way that families are. This is just normal. And then when you realize, you start interacting with other families and friends, and you realize that it's not. You know, I forget where I was going with this.
No, but it's a good point. You realize that is not normal. I mean, I got told over and over again, I would have all these fights with my mom growing up, and my linchpin statement in every fight was, well, people aren't like this everywhere. People are different. People are nicer. People are more supportive. My mom would look at me and go, no, they're not. Deal with the world.
Yeah, which is so, just like shut you down, right? Just shuts you down. That's where I was going to go with that, though. I think, you know, one of the most cathartic things was when I started to talk with other survivors and I started to realize that everything I was going through was actually quite normal. A lot of the things that I was feeling, a lot of the ways that people were reacting to me, it was normal. And I keep hearing the same stories repeated over and over again, which is completely heartbreaking. But at the same time, it's like, okay, this is reality, and I'm not crazy. This is how people are treated when this happens.
Yeah, and there are things in my past, growing up as a survivor, that I felt horrified or ashamed about. One of the things I felt ashamed about was the fact that I got to a point in my teens. Now, in 5th grade, I declared myself a pacifist, which is a really good way to get your ass kicked on a daily basis. That's pretty much what happened. But I declared myself a pacifist. I was reading all this science fiction and fantasy that was all very liberal, and I believed in these principles and all that. So I get to like my latter teens, and I start having these feelings like I want to beat the crap out of the man my stepfather who abused me. I'm having these visions, these like fantasies about getting him in a room and kicking the shit out of him. Yeah. Pardon my language. But I'm a pacifist, and I felt like I was turning into a horrible person. Like, how could I have these thoughts? And getting involved in the community in more recent years, I've discovered that many, many survivors had these thoughts. They had these dangerous, violent thoughts, and it was normal. It didn't mean you were going to go do it. It meant that for many people, that's a stage we go through. That anger, that frustration, defense itself. I want to find the guy who hurt me or woman who hurt me or whatever, and I want to make them understand, and I want to make them pay. And that's not a noble thought, but it's a reasonable thing to go through, and you don't act on it, and it's a stage, and you go past it. But I would get stuck there going, why am I such a terrible person?
Yeah, because that's not who you really are. You know, that's just your anger is surfacing, and that's the way it's coming out. But you really hit the nail on the head when you said that, in terms of really wanting that other person to understand the effect that they had on you. And I think that is a huge disconnect in society, where people can go and they can do these things, but maybe they're narcissists, maybe they're sociopaths, maybe they don't really feel empathy, and maybe they never will. And that is a really hard part of being a survivor, because you just want them to understand and also, in a way, validate your pain. You know? And I don't know that that's something anyone will ever find.
Well, it's an interesting thing, because it's something that comes up frequently in discussions, obviously. And we were touring Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor up and down the East Coast in 2015. And we did a show at I think it was called North Carolina Stage in Asheville. And it was an amazing show.
Wait, Michael, before you get too much into that, for the people who are listening, can you give them a background on what Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor show is?
Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor is it's sort of my offering to the community to try to change things and change attitudes and ideas. Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor is a theatrical show where I go on stage and I tell the story of my abuse and healing and all that stuff. But the really unusual thing about it is that it is entirely interactive. I will get on stage and I'll tell maybe 5 minutes of my story. And then we'll go to a break where the audience can ask questions, make comments, we can have a discussion about this. And it happens throughout. So the idea is that what we do is we foster this conversation that we need to have. And people are able to find solace in that there are fellow survivors. Non-survivors are able to learn about what it means to be a survivor and to ask the questions they need to. Sometimes the questions aren't answered by me, they're answered by other people in the audience. That's awesome. And we were doing this show at North Carolina Stage, and we had all the feedback breaks all throughout. We get to the end of the show, and nobody wanted to leave. They wanted the conversation to continue, which was so just invigorating and inspirational for me. Like, this thing I was doing was like really getting people to have that conversation. And we're sitting down, hanging out in the audience, chatting back and forth. And at one point I turned to the guy who was sitting there who ran the place. I said, "We got to go, right?" He's like, No. You're doing good work. Stay." And this woman starts talking about the fact that ever since she was a teenager, she's been trying to tell her mother about the abuse that she experienced. And every time she's opened her mouth, her mother has changed the subject and essentially shut her down. And she's still trying. This woman's like 50, and she's been trying every 5 or 6 years to have this conversation with her mother. And her mother shuts her down. So we started talking about something that I actually learned from a book called A Soprano on Her Head by Eloise Ristad. People should look up this book. It is ostensibly about performers who have insecurities and difficulties and that interfere with them being able to do what they're capable of doing as performers. But really what it says to me and what it's about for me is it's about dealing with personal anxiety and personal doubt and all these wonderful things. And when she talked about this thing called releasing the outcome, releasing the outcome means the only thing you can control in the world is what you do. You cannot control how someone's going to respond to what you do. If you go in going, "I'm going to talk to my mother and she's going to have great empathy and she's going to support me, she's going to love me, and she's finally going to see," you can't control that. You can't turn her into another person. You don't know what she's going to do. The outcome is something you have no impact on whatsoever. But if you change what your goal is that you want to tell your story to your mother. So you go in saying, "You know what? If she tries to shut me down, I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to tell my story. I'm going to tell my mother what I need to tell my mother."
Make her uncomfortable. Do it.
Whatever. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And your goal, though, your ultimate goal is one you can achieve, which is that you told the story, that you talked to your mother. If that's what you're trying to achieve, that's what you have control over. Yeah. She may, run the other way. She may try to talk about knitting or something, but your goal, you have achieved it. And I think that simple thing about releasing the outcome has made such a difference in my life. Because of all the times when I wanted my mom to respond a certain way, I wanted friends to respond in a certain way. The only person I can control is me. And it speaks to when I do ask a sex abuse survivor, because I go on stage and there are bits of it that are supposed to be kind of funny to kind of break the darkness. And there are bits of it that are very serious, and there are bits of it that hopefully to some degree are revelatory. But I can't go on expecting people to they're going to laugh here. They're going to be astounded here. Right. They're going to talk about this or talk about that. I have to go on stage going, the only thing I can do is tell a story and respond to questions and have this conversation. But what's exciting about releasing the outcome is you don't know what the questions are going to be. You don't know what kind of conversation you're going to have. You don't, if you leave yourself open to the wonders of that, exactly. You know what I'm saying? If you leave yourself open to the wonder of what you can find if you allow that, you get these constant riches in all walks of life. Everything you do, you get these constant riches like, I never could have thought of that. I never would have thought of that. I never would have had this. I never would have learned that about myself or about my story, if not for somebody saying that and blowing my mind.
That's such an interesting philosophy to live by too, because I find that I feel that way, not just as a creative, but across the board. And I think it does tie back to abuse, the lack of control. Having that lack of control, it makes me want to control everything else. So I am definitely like that, where I'm always worried about the outcome, And I have flailed publicly because of the anxiety behind that. So that's a really good, interesting concept to go into things, even interviewing you today, right? That's a great way to think about it now and say, you know what, if it hits that, like if it's just terrible, if it's complete shit, oh well, that's fine, right? Just
it is what it is.
On,
I did the thing.
yeah, just focus on what you want to get out of it, you know, or what your goal is and what you're trying to achieve.
And more often than not, if you open that up, that's the best interview. That's the best show. That's the best conversation you have with somebody, because you're allowing that space where you learn. I mean, a really good example. I know I'm not going to talk about the show during the entire interview, but this is a really good example. The show has morphed and molded constantly from the time it was created up till now, and it will continue to morph because of the conversations I have with people at shows. Yeah. And a great example of that is the very first time I did the show, which worked miraculously well. I was stunned. I'm like, this is going to be growing pains. It's going to be difficult. Nobody's going to want to talk. Worked brilliantly well. So the show at that point was ending with what I thought was a down note, because I still felt kind of sad and kind of desperate about my healing. And at the end, I talk about how, this has happened and that's happened, and I'm still going through panic attacks, and I'm still going through, this, that, and the other thing, and I still deal with all this stuff every day. But I guess because I'm able to talk about it, I guess in the end I win. My abuser loses and I win. And it was supposed to be this really sad, I guess I win. I win. And then there's a blackout. Well, right after the first show, someone comes up to me, a friend, and says, my God, that's so powerful. You're right. We beat him. We win. That's so cool that it's such an open and a powerful show that we win. Completely what I intended.
I was going to say, did your heart explode with just love and joy?
Oh my God. And from every performance after that, it became this rallying cry at the end, because it turned from I win and this dark thing, it turned from I win, we win, blackout. And then the lights come back up and everybody's like, yay! And it becomes this total inspirational thing, because she found it so inspirational. She's like, I'm going home now, and I'm going to feel much better about stuff, because if we live a good life, we win. And I'm like, that is so cool. And there's been so many moments like that throughout the years. I've been doing it since 2014. They've taught me things about my story that have then ended up getting worked into the show. There was a performance where I've always said I don't have recovered memories. I don't have recovered memories. It's not a thing I have. I understand other people have them. I don't have them.
I mean, at all of any of the...
I didn't believe that I had recovered. I have memories.
Okay.
I believe that the memories I had of the abuse were the only memories of the abuse. There were no recovered memories.
Okay.
However, I had a conversation some years back with my sister on the phone, and I said, Mom was terrible to us. Mom was abusive, emotionally abusive to us and physically abusive to us. But at least she did one thing. When I told her what Harold was doing to us, at the time I didn't know it was us. I thought that was me. When I told her what Harold was doing, she kicked him out of the house and she never let him get near us again. And she was like, I guess you don't remember that after that, she let him come back and take each of us for private child visits.
Oh, my God.
Can you do it? And she said that, and I went, holy crap, there's this nightmare that I've been having of being, like, I thought from 7 to 8 was my abuse, where I'm like 11 or 12, and I'm in a steam bath with my stepfather, and I'm getting slammed up against the tile and raped repeatedly. And I went, it's just a nightmare. It's pushed by the fact that it never happened. She said that, and that nightmare, I was like, oh my God, that's a memory.
So
and
that was a memory just trying to surface.
It all came tumbling out. All the other memories I had, that's why I have a 4-year history of this. I thought I had a 1-year history. I thought I remembered everything.
Yeah.
I literally was talking about that conversation at a show, okay? And then I went to the break, and I'd said earlier, I don't have recovered memories, but I had no perspective on it. The person said, well, you just said you don't have recovered memories, but what the hell was that conversation you had with your sister? And I'm like,
it all start piecing together.
You're so right. Because sometimes you can't see what's in front of you. And I was like, wow. Yeah. I had all the information, and I was even telling the story, but I didn't get it. And since then, there's been all these moments over the years that have been these healing breakthroughs and these growth moments. And each one of these growth moments gets added to the show.
Oh,
and so the balance of pain and healing gets more even, and the healing becomes the important thing. We're going to show you what the pain is like, but now we're going to show you that there is hope.
Yeah.
And oh my God, like I've had so many weird, nonsensical moments where I went, I feel better now.
Well, I think that's a really important point to touch on too, because I feel like a lot of people don't understand that concept. When I came forward, there were a lot of very inappropriate things that my abuser did that weren't things that he could necessarily go to jail for. They were incredibly inappropriate, pretty disgusting, but not the actual thing that could send him to jail. And but I knew. I felt it and I knew, and it wasn't until earlier this year where I actually started to have flashbacks of the actual event, which is traumatic in itself when you start remembering that. But I think it's really important to drive that home to anyone who may be listening who's not a survivor, because I think when survivors do come forward and they try to explain that, they just look crazy or they're making things up. But there is a psychological element to that people really don't understand.
Yeah, when we talk about grooming, and grooming is so many different things. People need to, if people understood grooming who are not survivors in the justice system or in the medical community, that would make all the difference in the world. Because grooming means a hell of a lot of different things. Grooming means the way my stepfather groomed me, ultimately to be responsive when he finally started raping me. I mean, he taught me, he groomed me, he normalized it to the point that, like you said earlier.
You mean physically? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. But I mean, he groomed me mentally, emotionally to start with. And so by the time it happened, he groomed me with, oh my God. So my mom finds me with one of my stepfather's Playboy magazines. And I was like 7. I didn't know what the pictures meant. I just knew I wasn't supposed to look at it. So I was looking at it because I wasn't supposed to look at it. I had no idea. I had no clue what it was. And she decides that, well, because I'm looking at this, it's time that my stepfather gave me the talk, told me the facts of life. His version of giving me the talk was to take me in and to masturbate in front of me. Ugh. That was the talk. I know it's horrific to say, but that's what it was. And he groomed me with pornography. He groomed me, to the point where then I started to accept that this was normal. It was horrible and I hated it, but I thought it was normal. This is what fathers and sons do. And I was always in pain, but I was like, well, there's nothing I can say because it's normal. But then there's the other side of grooming, where they groom the community, to believe that not just that they wouldn't do it, but that they're wonderful, nice, amazing people. It's the people who go and they say, I'm going to be a pillar of my community. I'm going to work for all these charities. And plenty of people who do that are honestly caring, loving people. But it gets confusing because a lot of people do that to create a suit of armor around themselves, a nice guy suit of armor.
Yeah.
So when they're accused, people will be like,
no way.
But he teaches kids. He's a wonderful person. He contributes to all these charities. He spends all of his time caring about his fellow human beings.
Yeah.
He could possibly have done it, which is why you get things like, well, I can't believe Bill Cosby was a rapist. Well, he groomed the entire planet with the Cosby. He created this ultimate dad. This is the wonderful dad. And I don't make memes often, but I made a meme up over that. And the top of it was a picture of him in the Cosby Show. And in top said fake dad. And the bottom said real rapist, and was a picture of him at his trial. And the bottom of that said know the difference.
Yeah.
He created this image where people were like, oh, Bill Cosby wouldn't do that. Bill Cosby's America's dad. Well, they groom the freaking planet, or they groom the neighborhood, or they groom the family. And they create a situation where if you say something, you're crazy.
Yeah. I was groomed in a similar way. It was more through like psychological manipulation where my abuser during our nightly prayers.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of, he said, I'm just so glad. I thank God that I never molested you. He said that during prayers. And then to go and like how you're talking about how the public is groomed, he has also positioned himself as a devout Catholic, a good all Catholic person who's involved with like Catholic charities and all this stuff. So when I did come forward, well, he's just such a great guy. He's never done that to me. I've never seen him do anything like, you know what I mean? And it's like, well, one, you were groomed, and two, abusers don't abuse every single person they encounter.
That's the big, oh my God, that's a giant, giant, giant flag that should be up there, that they don't abuse everyone. The whole Michael Jackson thing, where like he abused some kids and not others, and they actually use that as evidence that, Macaulay Culkin says he wasn't abused. Now, I don't know if Macaulay Culkin was abused or not, because he groomed those kids in such a way that they felt that Michael loved them. So they didn't see it as abuse. I mean, I went to When I saw Leaving Neverland, it was in one 4-hour long chunk.
You watched the entire thing?
I watched the entire thing in an afternoon because we were invited to a screening. 1 in 6 let me know that they were looking for men to be in the audience for this Oprah special. And what we were going to do is go up to New York and we were going to watch Leaving Neverland. And then After Neverland would start after that with the two.
So you were at the Oprah special?
I was in the audience for the Oprah special. So
very cool.
First, they did breaks. We had a lunch break. We had breaks, but it's still 4 freaking hours of triggers. Yeah. But I watched this whole thing and I'm like, my God. When you look at a survivor, I think when any of us look at a survivor, we can often tell whether they're telling the truth by their gestures, the way they hold themselves, the sound of their voice. When I looked at Christine Blasey Ford with the hair in front of her,
oh yes,
she's a survivor. It is so true that that man attempted to rape her. We've got that, and it's probably happened at other times too.
You want to know one of the most fascinating things I thought about that too was that men are allowed to be aggressive and they're allowed to be angry, but women are not. So here you have two people in this trial, and she is. The amount of composure that she had during that, and you could tell she was getting choked up and she was really emotional, but she kept it together and just had this really great presence where he was being like flippant and, being aggressive and angry, but yet she was still looked at as being a liar.
And she had to work so hard. We have to work so hard to achieve that so people will understand and listen. And he was able to just go off completely and be a 16-year-old drunk again and yell and scream, and yet he ends up on the Supreme Court and she ends up disbelieved, which is insane. And the same thing with Michael Jackson. We watched this whole thing and go, my God, these guys didn't realize that they were abused until they were adults. And the reason they didn't realize is because they were groomed, and then they had kids of their own. And they both had that same moment of revelation. Wait a minute. How would I feel if Michael was doing the things to my kids if he did to me? Yeah. Oh my God, I was abused. And it's when you see these guys in the documentary and then see them walk up on stage, and I was in the front row, I was like a couple of yards away from them, they're telling the truth. And it's absolute that they're telling the truth. But people, I've often been told that my opinion is not valid about whether somebody has actually abused or not, whether actually somebody's a survivor, because I'm too close to it. When in fact, the opposite is true. We know so much that we can tell the difference between a lie and a truth. I could tell that Woody Allen abused, his adoptive daughter, because I could listen to her story and read her story and go, this is real, the same way her brother understood it. This is real. I could listen to Christine Blasey Ford. I mean, I didn't even know it years ago when I was watching the Anita Hill hearings, but I was convinced, because I wasn't always as sort of conscious of that ability. It was a subconscious thing. And I went to the Anita Hill hearings going, my God, this poor woman, and she's being treated horribly. And then they did it again with Christine Blasey Ford, and they did the exact same thing. They gave her like a show of like listening, but they weren't listening. No. They had no interest in listening to her. No. And we need to break these barriers. We really do, because we're the ones who are experts. We're the ones who understand it. We're the ones who not just been through it, but we can spot other people who are through it. We can see people who are lying, who are abusers, who are predators. We can tell the difference. And it's our voices that are going to make a huge difference in changing this whole system and actually making progress.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that abuse survivors are not believed? And I mean, let me know if you feel differently about this. I think that, in my opinion, I feel like men are a little bit more believable when they come forward because of the stigma attached to it. And I think people associate that with, well, if they're, brave enough to bypass that stigma, it must be true. But I find that women really aren't believed at all. I wasn't believed. And right. Certain members of my family still do not believe me. So I'm always curious to hear why people think that is.
I think there is, and I think that certainly, despite the fact that Christine Blasey Ford maintained her composure, despite the fact that all these people maintain their composure, the assumption, and it's certainly, I base this on what people actually say about it, that the concept of being too close to it, that I'm overly emotional, that I'm not reacting from actual knowledge. I'm reacting from the fact that I was abused, and therefore I see abusers everywhere because I was abused, and I am irrational about it, And this is the reaction that I got. This is the reaction that so many people have gotten publicly. This is the reaction so many fellow survivors get. We're told to stay in our lane because we can't talk about this because we're too emotionally close to it, and therefore we're irrational. And again, like I said, I think it's 100% the other direction. We have been forced in our lives, okay, to find a way to kind of corral our emotions so we can tell the truth of what we've been through so people will listen to us. But the fact that we have emotional reactions to what we've been through just points up that these things happen to us, and therefore they're triggers. Yeah. And so that's what I think a lot of it is. The interesting thing you said about men and women, like you're right, men, it's like so horrific that this would happen to a man. People are like, oh, they must be telling the truth. I don't think that's always true, but I think a lot of times it's true. At the same time, I've also seen situations where men aren't believed by other men because that doesn't happen to men. That just doesn't happen to men.
Right. Or they should have somehow enjoyed it because men are supposed to be more sexual than women, which, as we both know, is bullshit. But
it's crazy.
Yeah.
I used the word crazy. You know what? I think I'm entitled to use the word crazy because I know I have mental health challenges. Therefore, it's our word. It's okay. I can say it.
Taking that word back.
Taking the word back. Yeah, I think you're right about that. That it's a situation where we need to flip the script. We need to flip the script and get people to get this. And you're right, women are not believed. Men are often not believed. One thing that it gets complicated when you look at the fact that you've got little girls, okay, who some of them are just entering into puberty. And because of that, they start having physical reactions to the person, the adult who's abusing them. And talk about freaking confusion. This person is hurting them, but they're having a physical reaction that feels good. That's a very complicated thing to figure out. And I've learned another wrinkle about this. People who were abused by men who happen to be gay, which is something you are from the time you were born. It's not, they don't become gay. I certainly went through a long period of trying to figure out whether I was gay because of what I'd been through. And I was open to the idea, and I explored and I found out I wasn't gay, but it would have been cool if I was. But you have this same complicated thing happens with gay men being abused by men and straight women being abused by men, and even more intense wrinkle now, men who are abused by women. Yep. By adult women. One of the most horrific things is when you see these articles that come out saying adult teacher is accused of having a sexual relationship with her 15-year-old student. She didn't have a sexual relationship. She raped that child.
And I love that you hit on that because I feel like in the media right now, that is so important. And I'm starting to see a lot of people, especially if something's posted on social media or like a news outlet posts something on social media, people go in and they go in hard where they say sexual misconduct or, and everyone's like, call it what it is. It's rape. Mm-hmm. Call it rape.
Use the word.
Use the word. Stop watering it down. Yeah,
exactly. I did a speaking thing for Women Organized Against Rape, which is an incredible organization here in Philadelphia. And what my whole thing was, it was because you get like 3 minutes to talk. So my 3 minutes was use the word, use the word, use the freaking word. Let's stop talking about. See, this is the thing. You talk about childhood sexual abuse, and while that is accurate, it in ways is kind of non-specific. So it could be anything. It could be that they showed the kid porn. It could be that they had sex with the kid and raped the kid. It could be all kinds of things. And I think that term, in some ways, allows certain people to kind of not have to think about it. Yeah. They see this child sexual abuse. Well, I don't have to concern myself with that. I have nothing to do with that. And besides, who knows what really happened? I was raped as a child. I know rape is a triggering word for many of us, and I try to be careful about that. But at the same time, I try to use the word, and I certainly use the word in my show because this is what people need to understand. When I was putting together this show, one of the early things was I really wanted people to see for the first time what the experience was like as a child being raped, because many people have written books about it and there's been movies about it. But when they get to what actually happens, that kind of gets put in the background and they imply it. They imply that this happened. You never see that it happened. And you don't certainly want it out there so, pedophiles are getting off on it. But at the same time, I think many people can separate themselves from the situation because of the fact that they don't have a real understanding of what happened. And so I went back and forth. Am I going to portray this? Am I going to portray this? And I figured out that you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to portray it, and I portray it. You only have to do it once. I portray the pain. I portray the agony. I portray the horror one time in the beginning of the show, and then you can refer to it afterwards. And I remember saying, every time I would do the show, I'd talk to people afterwards and go, was that too much? I'd be like, no, do that. Yeah. The most amazing thing was, I do work for University of Pennsylvania occasionally as a standardized patient, which means I go learn a case and I go in and the students practice on me. And the woman who runs the program popped up at one of my shows, like the boss's 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 boss. And I'm like, Denise is here. And we're talking afterwards, and she's complimenting me on the whole show, but particularly on that part. She's like, it is so important that you did that, because people don't see what's really happening. And it's, even if you look at, we were just talking about this the other day, you have the sex offender registry, right? The thing about the sex offender registry, and it's a great advancement, and it's wonderful. Megan's Law, fantastic. But there are limitations. What is on a sex offender's entry depends upon the state they come from, what they can and cannot say.
Oh, okay.
So you've got a good example of a magician who was doing kids' parties, who was on the sex offender registry for having sex with a child under the age of 18. He raped a 14-year-old repeatedly. But that's what his entry
That's the way they put it.
That's the way they put it. And so people are able to sort of pull themselves away. And I think we need to get closer and closer to what's really, really happening. I think people should not be out there feeling bad. Worldwide, children are being raped all over the freaking world right now. This is happening. And these children are being permanently damaged. Okay, they're going to have to work the rest of their lives to heal. And to me, healing is an ongoing process. I mean, forever. I don't expect ever to be healed, right? As a side thing, actually, one of the biggest barriers to me in healing was the fact that I thought I was going to get healed and then it would be over and I would never have another dream. I never had another flashback. I wouldn't have panic attacks. I'd be fine. So I'd go for therapy for a few years and it wouldn't happen. So I'd be like, screw this, and I'd stop. And then I'd start going to therapy again a little later on. I went on and off and on and off and on and off. And I just had totally given up on it by the time I met my wife. Okay, the woman who would become my wife. And I was in my 40s by that point. And I was like, this is never going to get fixed. And I was in this place where if I made a mistake of any kind, I tore myself apart for it. I treated myself like you were the worst non-functional piece of crap I've ever seen. I felt bad that she got stuck with me because I was so non-functional, because I was so non-communicative, because I was so, literally, it's not healthy. But I would say to her, I'm sorry you got a broken one. I'll try to do better. And she was like, no. She's like, I want to find out how to reach you and how to help you, but I can't figure out how to do it. So will you go into therapy for me, for you, and for our marriage? And that, what I had with her, was and is so important to me in life and so vital to my existence that it got me to go back in therapy when I'd given up. Yeah. And for the first time, I was with a trauma-informed therapist. And for the first time, I was making progress.
You found the right one.
Exactly. And
in your marriage and therapy.
Exactly. And for the first time, I understood that, as you said, healing is a journey.
Yeah. And
that my marks for advancement and for progress were not that one day I'm suddenly healed. They were that I'm learning coping strategies. Yeah. That when I have a panic attack or when I have a depressive episode or whatever happens, I can use these coping strategies to get through. I can answer with these coping strategies. They don't make my life wonderful. They don't fix everything, but they mean I understand this is happening. And I understand this is not because I'm a failure as a person. This is because these things will happen because of what happened to me. And here's the coping mechanism to mitigate them to some degree so I can get through. And every coping mechanism is a hash mark along the healing process.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that point up because I feel like that was a huge epiphany in my healing journey too. I've always had this mindset of if I work hard enough, I can have whatever I want. If I work hard enough, I work hard enough. So when it came to therapy, I was like, I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to work hard on it. I'm going to learn all the tools I need, and we're going to fix this problem. And I started to run into those same barriers where I kept hitting my head up against the wall every time I would fail. And it took probably up until the past year, it took a very long time for me to figure out, you know what, it's not something that's fixable. It's not
Right.
something that's going to go away. It's going to be in how you learn how to deal with it. And I think a lot of people need to hear that so they don't keep hitting their heads up against the wall like we did. And I also love that you were, touching on your marriage, because I think something that I've really been thinking about a lot. I'm single, and I've been single for some time, and I go through this thought process of, because what I've went through, is it possible for me to be in a healthy relationship? Like, what are your thoughts on that? And like, do you have any advice for other survivors who feel the same way?
Well, I wouldn't have until finally I found Christy, thought that it was possible. I had a lot of the kind of relationships we're always familiar with, where you don't realize it, but you're essentially emotionally unavailable because you're trying to be something for that person that they'll be happy with. And you think to yourself, well, I don't want to put the burden on them of all this other stuff, because that's going to make life difficult for them. I don't want to do that for them because they're there for me. And so I would often create these walls where I would not go beyond them, how I would talk to somebody about that. And so I look at a lot of my past relationships and I'm like, it wasn't anyone's fault per se, but I do bear some of the blame for those not working, because I was not available to the person who was supposed to be the closest person to me in my life. And I accept that. But what happened when I got into trauma-informed therapy was that Christy wanted to know about therapy. She wanted to know about what we were talking about. She wanted to know about what I was learning. She wanted to have conversations with me about it. And because she was willing to do that, we were able to find places where we meet. Okay, like a good example is dissociation. I certainly used dissociation unconsciously as a survival mechanism when I was a child, where, horrible things are happening to your body. So your brain separates and goes somewhere else. I would go to the 100-acre wood with Winnie the Pooh, and I would go over there for a while. That was my thing. And because I mentally, emotionally, if I'd stayed in my body, I would never have survived. And I didn't know I was doing it, but I was doing it. Okay, I get to be an adult. Dissociation becomes a reflex. I'm not even conscious of it. It's happening both when I'm under any kind of stress, even the slightest amount of stress, and sometimes just randomly. So we're having a conversation, Christy and I, and she says something very important to me, and my brain is over here. And I respond in a way that shows I didn't have any idea what she said. Naturally, she's offended. I'm your wife. Why aren't you listening to me? I'm the most important. You're not listening to me. We were able to get over the dissociation hump because I came and talked to her about trauma, about the trauma therapy I was having, and about talking about dissociation. I said, there's this thing, and I want you to know. And she was so open to it. I want you to know that there are times when you will be talking to me, because my brain is in this automatic state where sometimes it goes away, even when there isn't stress, that I will not hear what you said. And I will have to ask you to repeat. And it's not because I don't love you. It's not because I don't care. It's not because I don't think what you're saying is vital. It is. It's because there's this thing that I'm trying to mitigate and work with. And she was like, well, okay, if this happens to you, just tell me this happened to you. Just say, you know what? I dissociated. Give me a second to grab that balloon that floated away, which is my image I got for it, and pull it down back in front of you. You know what I mean? Because your brain goes, ooh,
I like the visual.
yeah, you grab it and you're like, get it to right here.
Yeah.
And I'm allowed to say, I didn't hear what you said because I dissociated. And we've had so many conversations about so many different things for that reason. And I think that it's a combination of things. It's me being with a therapist where I'm becoming aware of all these things that I do, and being with somebody who is willing to talk it through. We take walks and we talk through all kinds of stuff. And I think if you can find somebody who's willing to really communicate, that's the thing. And I don't think that it's like there's no one out there who does that. There are people out there. Yeah. But they just need to be presented with the idea that, you know what, this thing happened to me, and it's terrible and it affects my behavior. And because it affects my behavior and we're together, I would like to be able to talk openly with you about it. And I think that I didn't realize that I could do that. Year after year, I didn't realize that I could do that. And you can't do that with everybody.
No.
But if you give it a shot,
Yeah.
You have every chance of finding the one you can do that with. And they're going to make mistakes. They're going to do things that'll trigger you because they're learning as you're learning.
Yeah.
And I can't get angry at her for triggering me because I'm like, okay, that's a trigger. And I'm becoming more and more conscious of when I'm being triggered. And when she says something that happens to sound like something that somebody said to me who abused me or just dismissed me, I'm like, well, wait a minute. I'm not actually angry at you. I'm angry at this other person. And to become that conscious that you're not reacting from, I've destroyed friendships that way because I was reacting to the words they chose or the sound of their voice or the circumstances, not to them. And that's been a major part of me being able to heal and have better friendships too, is that I've learned that I'm being triggered and it's not you. And I'm not perfect. Every once in a while I respond and I'm like, okay, hold on.
Yeah, I need a breather. I can see that. And I think as you go through your healing process and you start to become more familiar with how you're triggered or recognizing triggers when they come up, it becomes a lot easier to recognize that that person is not the one hurting you, that it's actually a trigger. And I think that that's a very important point too. So you would say that the two most important factors are, open communication and then also someone who's supportive and receptive to those conversations.
Certainly. An additional, a third point of just taking the time to know yourself. So as you said earlier, just a minute ago, about triggers, when you're being triggered, when it's actually not the person you're reacting to. And also, you know what, if you're reacting to a trigger from your spouse or your friend, you should be able to say to them, okay, I was just triggered by that. It's not you I'm reacting to. However, here's the thing I get triggered by. So you may want to take that into account on my end for the future, so they can be and you don't want to get to the point, and I've had this happen to me in the past with other relationships, like, oh, I have to walk on eggshells with you because you react like so negatively to things. And so you don't want people to be like that. But at the same time, there are things that people do by accident simply because they don't know the psychology of a survivor and they don't mean to hurt you, but they just don't know.
Yeah, for sure. And you have to educate them on that. I totally agree. Now, we've talked a lot about the things that you've learned and how it seems like you are getting a really good grip on your healing process and learning about yourself and what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Has there been a period of your life where you went through, maybe trying to use unhealthy behaviors to mask or avoid your issues? And what were those?
Well, I mean, very early on, I think by the time I was 13, I was a pretty heavy drinker. I was an alcoholic, and alcoholism runs through my family. And that's something you become cognizant of when it's years later. You're like, oh my God, look, we're all these alcoholics in my family. But I drank a lot, and I started taking pills. And the reason that I did this, now I realize what I was doing. I didn't realize it at the time. What I was doing was, if I numbed my brain, it was harder to have flashbacks. And if I numbed my brain, it was harder to have nightmares. And if I drank to the point that I would black out, when you black out, you don't dream. So those things don't come back to visit you and to attack you at night.
Got it.
So, right. From 13 to 15, I was drinking, taking pills. I would basically, any pill anybody handed me, I would wash it down with like tequila, which is, I am so grateful. There is some kind of force out there protecting me because I could have been in a coma for the rest of my life. But I wasn't. I survived. By the age of 15, I had a horrible experience where I blacked out and I ended up like sort of in the middle of the street, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the winter. And I basically, what happened was I was somewhere and I had walked out the door, not realizing I was walking out the door, thinking I was walking to the kitchen, if I trace it back, and then blacked out and then woke up, bloody because clearly somebody had beaten the crap out of me. Because when I got drunk, I would get pretty mouthy, and I was slipping on the ice, and I was hurting myself again and again and again. And I tried to find out where I'd been before, and I climbed up the stairs to somebody else's apartment, and I was knocking on their door, and the woman opened the door, and she looked at me and screamed because it probably looked like Quasimodo with all the bruises and the blood. Oh my God. And this was an intense situation, and she's like, she screams and she slams the door, and I'm like, well, that's it then, isn't it? I just sat down and I put my arms around myself and I said, well, tonight's the night that I die. I'll die of exposure. I just don't have a choice. And eventually the cops showed up because clearly she called the cops, and they picked me up. And luckily I lived in a small town where when they pick you up for drunk and disorderly, they take you to the police station, they send you into the bathroom, they say, go clean yourself up. And that's when I discovered how badly I'd been beaten. And they take you home. And they took me home. And I laid down on the couch. My mother, when she opened the door, she was like, oh, Christ almighty.
Like, what the hell? Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like what the hell like she cared. It was like, oh, Christ. And I climbed under the couch and I fell asleep. And the next morning I woke up and I said, I'm never fucking drinking ever again. And I didn't use a program. I went cold turkey. I stopped drinking. I stopped taking pills. So by, 15, 16, I was a recovering alcoholic and a recovering drug addict.
Wow.
And the problem is when I stopped doing all this stuff in sobriety, there wasn't this wonderful, pretty, lovely flowered world. There was the nightmares and the flashbacks and the depression and the anxiety. It all just came back. So I struggled continuously in my life with that while kicking the thing that in a very unhealthy way that I had used. So yeah, I went through that. That was definitely an unhealthy thing. And one of the other unhealthy things was simply not communicating with people. Not, just reacting, just reacting out of my gut to people. And so I got into a lot of arguments. I got into a lot of, I didn't know myself well enough to be able to handle myself and be able to actually do anything that had anything to do with coping. I was just reacting to things over and over and over again. And that was, that's very unhealthy, not being self-aware. Yeah. And, it's something that I feel so fortunate that I'm still here to learn, because there were so many times. If I look at my life over time, not just that one night, but there's so many different times for different reasons where I could have been gone. I could have been gone forever.
You're like a cat. You have 9 lives.
That's the thing. Like, and I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Mm-hmm. And I believe that there was some force out there that was saying, you know what? You got to do something important. So we're holding on to you. You're going to do something important. You need to do something important. And this is something looking back on that I realized. I'm like, looking at what I do now, I'm like, well, somebody kept me around for that. I can't say being a recovering Catholic, I'm not necessarily hip with that philosophy. But there's just something that connects us together that I was so very, very lucky with all of the negative things I did and all of the things that could have hurt me very badly. I'm talking about bad coping mechanisms. It wasn't even a coping mechanism. I guess it was, in a sense, it was a coping mechanism. My mom, after she kicked my stepfather out, my mom was no barrel of laughs either. She was very emotionally abusive. She was very verbally abusive. And at times she was very physically abusive, beat the crap out of us. And I got to the point when I was like 17. I was like, I can't take this anymore. I have to do something. And I left and I ran across the country to Arizona, where I had a pen pal there. And of course, in my mind, there was this thing. I was going to show up at her door and she was going to take me in and everything was going to be fine. I never asked her about that. I showed up at her door, discovered she lived with her aunt. It was like, why should I take this freak in? I'm not going to do that. And so I had nowhere to go and I was on the street. And I discovered at one point the area that I was in, I discovered by somebody pulling up next to me and saying, are you hustling? This is where the male prostitution goes on. Well, it was something I knew how to do because I'd been trained by my stepfather. And I was desperate and I was starving and I needed someplace to live. And so I started doing that.
What was that first time like?
It was just, sorry, give me a second.
No, take your time. Take your time.
The first time was, it was having my head forced down again, like it had been when I was a child, when my stepfather was abusing me and being choked like I was when my stepfather was abusing me. And my brain just going, fuck, this will be over soon. 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 And it triggered me like crazy. But I was so desperate and I was starving. And so I kept doing it, And I had some horrible, weird experiences. I got picked up by a car full of born-again Christians who wanted me to pray with them.
Christians.
Christians, yes. They wanted me to pray with them because they wanted to fix me because I was out here doing this. And their way of fixing me was to go over a litany of all the horrible things that could possibly happen to me while I was doing this. They thought they would scare the crap out of me and I would stop. And so I got all these vivid descriptions of ways that I could be slashed and killed and beaten and all these other things.
And you're like, baby, you have no idea.
You have no clue, man.
I've already been there.
Exactly. And they were kind of scary. They were kind of scary. But all the and varying experiences that were interesting, because you would get people who just like, they were just to use you, but you get like the guy who had this sort of romantic thing that he obviously couldn't talk to men in his regular life, but he gets me in his apartment and he like picks me up in his arms and he carries me to the bed and it's this romantic thing for him. And it was very interesting because this guy was clearly trying to sort of fulfill this fantasy of this romantic encounter. And so I felt for him, and I felt good that I was there for him. But then the sex itself was just a reminder of what I was going through as a child and all these scars. And it just brought all the scars back. It brought all the scars back. And in the end, I had to actually call home. And my uncle, who's the only one in the family with any money, sent me money for the bus ticket to come back. Because I was desperate, I was starving, and I had to stop doing the hustling thing because it was hurting me so badly emotionally and physically. And I felt like I was going to get killed at some point if I didn't do something about this, or I was going to starve to death. And I came back basically with my tail between my legs and went to work at the plastic factory in Clinton, Massachusetts, because everybody worked for the plastic factory because that was the industry at the time, and just kept my mouth shut and my head down and did what I was told, because I didn't have any right to have an opinion or a feeling, because I'd almost starved to death because of my freaking feelings and opinions. And that was an unhealthy time where I tried to force myself to believe that I should just keep my head down and keep my mouth shut and keep it on and do what the family wanted me to do. And that was a terrible, unhealthy way to work with that. And, eventually I couldn't do that anymore because my mind and my body would not let me do that anymore. And
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm good.
When did you get to the point where you made the decision to look at healthier avenues of healing, whether that was coping mechanisms or just starting to go through the pain rather than trying to mask it or avoid it?
I kind of stumbled accidentally into what was my first coping mechanism that I didn't realize was a coping mechanism until many years later, pretty much until I started doing my show. I had eventually gotten to the point where I just sort of climbed up in my room, and I had such horrible agoraphobia that I didn't want to go out the front door. I was just like, I stay in my room, play my records, and, watch my little TV, and that was fine, and that was me, and I couldn't do anything else. And because I couldn't deal with life, society, people, nothing. And during that period of time, I had started watching a television show called Doctor Who. And I fell in love with this show because it was so weird and unusual and original. And my God.
Wait, Michael, for all the kids out there, can you explain who Doctor Who is?
Sorry. Okay. So Doctor Who is this British science fiction show. And the concept of Doctor Who started in 1963. It's still on the air now. It's the longest running science fiction show in the history of science fiction programming. The concept of Doctor Who is the Doctor is this guy from the planet Gallifrey. He's what they call a Time Lord. And because he's a Time Lord, he can regenerate, which means when he gets to the end of his current life, he can regenerate into a different actor with a different costume and a different personality. So this is one of the reasons the show's been going on and on and on, because you can always have a new Doctor. And the Doctor is not your science fiction hero with the laser gun, using violence. The Doctor has two hearts because he's a Time Lord, because he cares more. And the Doctor doesn't have a weapon. The Doctor has a sonic screwdriver because he's a doctor. He wants to fix you. He wants to help you. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. Don't apologize.
But he was this totally different concept, And he was so fatherly, and it was probably only a Delta that I respected was the Doctor. Mm-hmm. I didn't respect my mom. I didn't respect anybody else in my life. I had this total contempt for adults because of what had happened to me. Because these people who were supposed to take care of me, they hurt me. But there was this guy, and it was his Doctor, and I respected him. I respected that he would go into a situation where the aliens weren't always evil. Sometimes he would look and say, you know what? You humans, you're misunderstanding what's going on here. You've got to take the time to understand these people that you don't get. You've got to stop, thinking with guns and start thinking with your heart and your head. So this is who this guy is, Sorry. And
Take your time.
so I started watching this show, and it's something I'm doing by myself, and sorry. I'm watching this show, and I'm feeling like this is the first person I've ever respected in my life. I kind of, a friend of mine said, who I'd been in Doctor Who fandom with at the time, decades later said to me, to me the Doctor was like a father figure, because his dad had run out and he was with his mom, who was not nice to him, who was another terrible influence on him. And he said, to me the Doctor was my father figure. And I was like, look back, and I'm like, God, that's the same thing that happened to me now that I think about it. And so here I am, and I'm alone in my room, and I'm like, the Doctor is my only, the only adult I trust. He's my only friend in the world. And I found out about Doctor Who fan clubs, and I started joining fan clubs. And I got pen pals, who wanted to talk about Doctor Who and all this other stuff. And they were friends that I could have from a distance who couldn't get close enough to see into my eyes and see all the damage that was there. So they wouldn't run away, screaming, I can't deal with this. Mm-hmm. So I started to get these pen pal friends. And then I started to get flyers in the mail for Doctor Who conventions. I'm like, I can't leave the house. I can't deal with people. But I heard about this convention in Boston. And this guy, Tom Baker, who was the doctor I was watching on TV at the time, who was that wonderful father figure to me, he was going to be in Boston, which was only like a bus ride away. Okay. I could get on the bus. I could go. I could see. And nothing in my life could get me out the front door except that. I actually scraped up a little bit of money for a bus ticket, a little bit of money for the ticket. I actually walked out the front door, which was terrifying, and kind of kept my head down all the way because I didn't want to have people see me and like I'm not here, I don't exist. And I get to the convention, and I'm standing in line, and with my head down, trying not to be seen by anybody. I'm like, my hands in my pockets. I don't really exist. I'm standing in line waiting to get an autograph from Tom Baker because he's so cool. And somebody started talking to me. And they wouldn't stop talking to me. No matter how much I tried to look down, they wouldn't stop talking to me. And they were talking about Doctor Who, and they were talking about science fiction movies and TV shows and all this stuff that I thought, well, my mom told me nobody cared about but me, right? I was alone in the world. But suddenly I wasn't alone in the world. And this person was refusing to take my agoraphobia and my social anxiety as an answer. They were going to talk to me one way or the other. And I found myself eventually I had to give up and start talking to them. And then other people were hanging around talking. We're all sitting in line. We're all talking about all this stuff. And I found friends for the first time in my life. I found friends that I didn't feel like I had to run screaming away from people. These were people, they cared about all that geeky stuff that I wanted to talk about. All of a sudden, it's like, we've said many times recently at panels and conventions and stuff like that, we talk about these various things. And one of the things we talk about is, it's not that we're so socially inwardly turned. It's that you don't talk about shit we want to talk about. Yeah. You get me talking about Doctor Who or Robert Heinlein or Theodore Sturgeon or Star Trek, I'll talk. We don't want to talk about sports. We want to talk about, whether the Doctor, really did the right thing when he decided that the Silurians should be understood, even though they hated humanity. This is what we want to talk about. And that led to looking around and going, everyone's dressed up. I should dress up. And I started dressing like one of the doctors. And when you go and you dress up, even if you're shy and socially awkward, people come up to you and they talk to you. Yeah. And they want to talk to you and they want to get pictures with you and they treat you like you're the freaking doctor. You're cool, So I started to feel really, really good. And then I did the ultimate geek thing of all time. I started a fan club locally. We started this thing called the New England Time Lord Academy. I know this is a long story, but it's important. We started the New England Time Lord Academy, and we started going around in our costumes. We're going to pledge drives, and we're going to conventions, and we're helping out at cons, and we're all dressed up, and it's really, 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 really cool. And as my friend who I mentioned earlier, my friend Adam mentioned, many years later, we got together 30 years after the original thing, and we originally been together in the club, talked about, he's like, normal people, quote unquote normal people, they go to high school and college and they learn their social skills. We learned our social skills in fandom. Fandom was high school and college for us. We learned how to be with other people and how to have friends. And that was this coping mechanism that I didn't even realize. I didn't have the words coping mechanism back then. Yeah. But it got me out of the house. It got me friends. It got me feeling like I wasn't alone in the universe. And it's only looking back years later, I realized that that was my very first step that I ever made toward healing, was that.
Wow. Well, I have to say it's really amazing to watch you talk about that, because when you're talking about things that are painful, you can see and you hear the hurt in your voice, you can see it in your face, and as soon as you start talking about Doctor Who, you lit up the room. And I love seeing that, and it's so important that, you know, no matter who you are, what your journey is, that you have that in your life. One question that I do have for you is, in that moment when you got to that convention, was that the first time in your life that you genuinely felt free, or at least for a moment?
Yeah, it's that conversation with that person where the first part of it was me feeling terrified and trying to come up with good things to say. And, oh my God, what do I say? He's not going to think I'm a good fan. He's not going to like me if I don't say really cool things. And when I got past that part, and it just became, it was happening. I was no longer, because I spent my whole life, as many of us do, you tend to look at yourself from overhead. You look at your mind is always like looking down at yourself, and yourself is inwardly turned. And you're like, yeah, I'm just this guy that doesn't talk to anybody, and this is who I am. And I was constantly aware of everything I did, every move I made, the way I dressed. Am I inviting people to make fun of me, to screw with me? Am I being bullied because of the way I behave or the way I look? I need to fix that. I need to, and I just tried to be as small as possible so nobody would notice me. But I was all so self-conscious all the time. Well, it was the first time in my life that I realized afterwards that I'd stopped being self-conscious for a time. I was just in that moment. I mean, this is something that I think has affected my entire life. The idea of being present for your own life, and present for the joys of relationships, and present for the joys of sharing something you love with someone else, and present for the joys of going to the Bastille Day celebration in Philadelphia, where they throw tasty cakes over the battlements at Eastern State Penitentiary every year. To be present.
Yeah, it's Marie Antoinette, right? I've been to that.
Yes, it's wonderful. I love that. I love that thing where she gets up there and she says, let them eat tasty cakes, and she throws tasty cakes. But the fact that
it's like one of the most Philly things to happen, except it's French.
Yeah. Never, except it's French. But like, to be present for all those things. I was learning for the first time to be present and not self-conscious all the time. I still had a lot of self-consciousness to go, and I still deal with it now. But to be present is such a rich reward. And okay, with the whole Doctor Who thing, like, I stopped sometime in the latter 80s. I stopped going to cons. I stopped being involved in Doctor Who fandom because my life turned into something else, and that's cool. 30 years later, we all got together from the New England Time Lord Academy to have a dinner together. And I was like, oh my God, you people are the same as you were then. I guess so am I. But we're conscious about it. Yeah. And we started talking, and this is when I realized that every one of us had emotional, physical difficulties. We had things going on in our life that we couldn't talk about because we felt that if we talked about them, we would lose friends and nobody would want to deal with us. But every one of us was inwardly turned, trying to find that moment of feeling good about themselves and their life. And we all kept it to ourselves. But now we're not keeping it to ourselves. And then I decided at the end of that year I was going to go to my first convention in 30 years. And I went to my first convention in 2016. And I discovered and I got back in cosplay. I came up with a new cosplay, and I got back in cosplay. And I discovered, that they were treating me like the grand old man of conventions who knew everything.
That's awesome.
Wow, you saw Colin Baker when he first was the Doctor way back in like 1980.
Right.
Yes, in fact I did. I was there. And they're treating you like you're this oracle. Yeah. And these kids, 13, 14, 15, 16, they're talking about medications. They're talking about social anxiety. They're talking about being bipolar. They're talking about eating disorders. They're all talking above ground about it. We didn't do that. They're doing that. They're so healthy.
It's such a different generation now, and it's so beautiful to see people be able to have those open conversations with one another. We're going to wrap up in a second, but, with you talking about that, I would say that probably one of your top 5 most impactful things in your healing process, I would imagine, is community, partly community.
Absolutely. Yeah. Community.
For me, that is also one of the things that is really high up on the list. Also, speaking out, turning my pain into purpose. What would you say, and I love asking this question to survivors, what would you say are the 5 most impactful ingredients in your healing process, or what have been the most impactful?
Well, I would say, number 1, that sense of community that I now get through fandom. That's fantastic. And I also get it through the theater community where I work as well. So that sense of community is enormous. It makes me feel like I'm not alone and that other people are not cut off from me. I can actually speak about who I really am. And we can have those moments and those conversations which help both of us. Certainly having an open communication with my spouse about the ongoing healing process, major impact on my healing. I think being with a trauma-informed therapist as number 3. It's so important when we go out there. I feel if we're going to go try to heal from this kind of abuse, we should be with somebody who understands trauma. I mean, I learned from trauma-informed therapy that I had PTSD, and it didn't sound like a negative to me. It sounded like, oh, here's actually a bunch of information about what I'm going through, and it explains so much, and here's a way to meet it. So I'm up to 3 or 4. I'm up to 3, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. 4 is the show. I mean, seriously, the show. Yeah. Because I mentioned earlier, I learned so many things from doing the show and from that community and from the things that people reveal to me that I add. And I think the 5th thing is a specific person. And that specific person is my Aunt Jill, my mother's sister. My Aunt Jill, she is the only adult that I said before I had no adults I respect, and I often forget that I respected Aunt Jill at the time. I did respect Aunt Jill at the time. She and I never talked about abuse because that's not something you talk about in the family. It was forbidden. So she didn't know that back then. But we talked about movies and TV shows, and we talked about Elvis Costello because we were both big fans and all this other stuff. And she was the adult I could talk to about shit, you know? I couldn't talk to her about emotional problems, but I could talk to her about – she would respect me when we talked about books. She would respect me when we talked about music. It was like she didn't treat me like a kid. And some years back, actually it was in 2017, I had gone up to visit Jill because she was in the hospital. And we'd had this long conversation, and it was in the course of this conversation that I found out that A, Jill was a survivor, and B, my mother was a survivor. I had no idea. Talk about a freaking revelation and a half.
How did that make you feel?
That made me just, all of a sudden, everything that I'd seen her do and every way she had behaved was suddenly shown in a new light. Because she was a survivor trying to get through the day just like me. Yeah. I look at her behavior and beyond, I think she was certainly bipolar, which runs through our family. Certainly she was suffering PTSD. I think she also, to a degree, was schizophrenic because she would go into these catatonic states where she couldn't hear anybody. Okay. So there certainly was a schizophrenia element to it. Because when you get involved in this stuff, you learn all these different definitions and all these symptoms for various things. It's just becomes part of your life. So I'm having this conversation with Jill, and I'm learning all these amazing things. And then Jill gets out of the hospital. And I want to see my Aunt Jill, but my Aunt Jill lives in Clinton, Massachusetts, the town where it happened, the town where the horror happened. And I've been avoiding this town, hundreds of miles. I won't go near it. Yeah. Every time I go up to New England, I won't go near the town because it's too triggering for me. But I want to see Jill. I want to go spend some more time with Jill. So Christy and I got in the car and we drove up to see Jill in Clinton, and I got into Clinton. And when we got close and we got in there, I mean, I was feeling it. The triggers were, and we got to her house and we went inside, and I had this conversation with her that felt like no time had passed between now and when I was a kid talking to her. But we were talking about survivor things and about.
You got to have that conversation with her.
Yeah, wow. That conversation we never got to have. And I came out of that as we're leaving the house. We get in the driveway, and I turned to Christy, and I'm like, God, I feel so powerful right now. I was like, you know what? And I shocked myself. I said, let's drive around and look at some of the sites of my childhood. And of course, for me, sites of my childhood are where all the terrible crap happened. We went to the high school where I was bullied. We went to the middle school where I was bullied. There's a picture of me standing in front of the middle school with my arms folded, looking triumphant, because I'm standing in front of the building. I'm thinking, this is just a fucking building. This building can't hurt me. This is just a building. I'm way stronger than this building could possibly be. And at the end of all of it, very last thing, not surprisingly, we find ourselves parked across the street from the house I lived in, where I was often raped. where a lot of that terrible stuff happened. And we're across the street and we're looking at the house, and the house looks pretty beat up, pretty ratty, like, it's falling apart. And I'm like, well, let's go closer, which I didn't understand why I was saying this, but I was saying this. And we got across the street and we got real close up to the house, and the place was collapsing in upon itself. I sat down on the steps and I said, take a picture. And the picture is me feeling so triumphant because this is the horror house. This horror house is falling to dust. I am getting stronger every single freaking day. This house is getting weaker and weaker, and I'm getting stronger and stronger. I fucking win.
You win.
God damn it, I win.
You know what? And I think, too, that's such a really great indication of what true support can do for a survivor. I mean, because going back to your hometown, you felt like you couldn't even go into the town. And then just look at how much that lit a fire inside of you, having that conversation with your aunt, that you felt powerful enough to go face those things and face it right in the eye, look it right in the eye and say, you know what? Yeah. You don't win. I win. It's so powerful. And that actually leads me to another question, because I think, we've chatted on this a lot just in terms of how people react when survivors come forward. And, you're going to have people out there who are never going to believe them, and they're just, that's who they're going to be. But then you also have a large group of people who are just so uncomfortable, and they love that person, but they don't know how to react. They don't know what the right thing is to say, or they don't want to say the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the number one thing a person who has a survivor in their life should know?
A person who has a survivor in their life, the first thing is, there's many, many things, but these all kind of add up to the same thing, which is, if you know the person is a survivor, you tell them, if you need to talk, you can talk to me. And when they do talk to you, do not quiz them about details if they don't want to talk about details. Do not interrogate them. Say, I believe you. And, if there's anything that I can ever do to help you so I can support you better, you can bring that up anytime, and we'll talk about that. You can bring that up anytime, because all I want to do is support you.
I love it. I couldn't agree more. So I'm going to end on this question, and I love asking people this question because I feel like most people have a hard time talking about themselves or talking well about themselves.
Okay.
So I always like to ask it, and I'm curious as to how you'll answer. But what do you think so far has been your greatest contribution to the world?
Wow. I think the show is the greatest contribution I've given to the world, because it's actually worked the way I want to, and it's gotten people asking questions which are, the answers are enlightening to them. And it's done what I wanted to do, which is get people talking about this thing people don't talk about. Mm-hmm. Because the more we talk about it, the more normalized talking about it becomes, the better a world this is, not just for survivors, but for children, so they know that if they encounter this, they can speak up, because our culture now allows you to speak up, and therefore they don't have to be traumatized. They can say what they need to say. And I think that's my major contribution, is hopefully helping to open up that conversation.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And I think you're doing a really great job of that. Wow.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. It's just been such a pleasure. And again, I can't say enough how much of an inspiration I think you are.
And you are too. Seriously, thank you so much for today. This is not one of those situations where I feel like I hit a high of strength and actually happiness. I just feel, we talked about these horrible things, but I feel happy right now. I feel like there's hope. We're going to make this happen. And thank you, as I've said before, for what you're doing, because you have all these wonderful advantages that you're using to the advantage of the community, which is your ability to be organized, your ability to connect with other survivors, your ability to speak with clarity. These are all important things. When you talk about, in your videos, when you talk about different things that survivors deal with and how to meet those challenges and how to get yourself through that and understand more, you are so concise. You are so revelatory. So what you have is freaking platinum to our community. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. It's now you put me on the spot. Isn't it? It's so hard to talk well about yourself or hear compliments, and I struggle with that too. But I thank you so much, because it is, as you know, it's very difficult to put yourself out there like that. And I feel the same way. Anytime I talk with a survivor, I just said this the other night to a friend. I walk away with I just feel like I have so much joy in my heart. Yes. Obviously not for what has happened to that person, but just being able to identify with someone and connect with someone who knows what it feels like. It just fills my heart with so much joy that sometimes it feels like my heart's going to explode in a good way. In a good way. So morbid.
No, I get it. I get it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for joining us. And if you guys want to check out more about the Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor show, you can visit sexabusesurvivor.com. And you can also catch some of those clips on Michael's YouTube channel of the actual show. But he also has some really great content on there on what it's like to be a survivor, what the healing process is for a survivor. So if you are a survivor and you want to go check it out, do that. And if you are someone who loves a survivor, I think that content is also really helpful.
May I interject briefly to this the content thing? Definitely look for Ask a Survivor on Facebook, because I do a lot of stuff on Facebook. And actually, my videos tend to get posted first to Facebook, so you'll see them sooner. Okay. And also Instagram, I'm under Ask a Survivor Show. So I'll also do a lot of video stuff there as well. So those are places that you can hear me going on and on about what it's like to be a survivor.
Awesome. Yep. And I'll post all of those links below for YouTube, for Facebook, for Instagram, as well as Twitter. So anyone who wants to go check out Michael's content, you'll be able to do that there. Again, thanks so much for joining us today. Yep. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And until then, see you guys next time. Breathe. Now we just cross our fingers and hope that it recorded.